into our classroom. See, I served on the local school council. The coach know what he's talking about. I served on the local school council, and I've seen where they didn't put books in schools. There was no priority for books. The teachers were taking old books, buying paper out of their money, and going in there and copying the books so they can pass out literature to the students. This is what happens in the Chicago Public School in the quote urban and poor communities, because they know that there is a prison industrial complex that's funded by corporate America, and they know that they have to house people in these prisons. And as we tape this show, there's over 4 million men and women locked up and incarcerated across this country. Within that 4 million, 3 million of them are black men and black women. And within that 4 million, that includes the juvenile detention center, which includes 80% of the juvenile detention centers. The population is black male and black women. 80% of juveniles in prison. So they know that the criminal justice system is geared toward the dropout of young black, young males, and young Hispanics in this country. And they know that if we get them in the juvenile detention center, we will flip them over and have them in the prison system by the time they become 17, 18, and 19. So while you have over 3 million black men and women in jail, the other races, Hispanic, Asian, the Indians, the whites, make up 1 million in population. We spend over $4 billion a year to feed, to house, and clothe those men and women and young boys that are in jail. Over $4 billion a year is spent on the prison industrial complex to feed, house these men and women when they go to jail. Now, let me give you some facts that you must understand, because the myth is that crime is done in black communities, poor communities. The fact of the matter is that 70% of all crime committed in the United States of America, in this country, of all violent crimes in this country, 70% is committed by white people, white men and women, white young boys and girls. 70% of all the violent crimes in this country is committed by whites, while whites make up 20% of the prison population. 80% of the jails are filled with blacks throughout this country. In the state of Illinois, 80% of the jail population is black men and women. 14% of the jails of blacks in this country use drugs. The drug population of using drugs in this country is 14% black. Yet 80% of the jails in this country are filled with black men and women for drug charges. Hispanics make up 10% of the drug population in this country, the United States of America. Yet 15% of the prison population for drugs in these United States of America is Hispanic. 24% of the crime in the United States is done by white and Hispanics. Yet 90% of the jails are filled with blacks and Hispanics. So what has happened is we have a system, our Congress, our senator, our president, our state representative, our state senate, our aldermen, your community leaders know these numbers. We're not the biggest consumer of drugs, but we are the biggest consumers of the prisons. We're not the biggest consumers of crime in this country, but yet we populate the prisons at a 3-to-1 ratio of other races. Why? You wonder why there's a system in place that allows our schools to be failing systems. Because Master Richie and the powers that be that controls the flow of the wealth, they know that if we don't properly educate the Negro, our offsprings, our siblings will wind up the recipients of prisons and jails in this modern day era. The fact of the matter, when you take on the 60s, which was the civil rights movement, 75% of the prisons during the 60s, the movement, the civil rights struggle, 75% of the prison population was made up of white in the 60s. 25% of the prison population in the 60s was black and Hispanics during the civil rights struggle. And you know, we didn't stand a chance back then. You know, we were set up, you know what happened in the prisons. They doctored books, they killed you, they hung you, they lynched you, and nobody went to jail for that. But yet, 75% of the population during the civil rights struggle, the prison population, was whites. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, after the emancipation was signed and the Negro was no longer declared a slave, after the civil rights bills were signed by Lyndon Johnson, and there was no more quote-unquote discrimination, right, in America toward its people of color. In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and to date, the black population have become 75 to 80% of those incarcerated in prison since the civil rights struggles. Again, in the 60s, whites made up 75% of the prison population. And here in this 21st century, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, post-civil rights era, blacks now make up 75 to 80% of the prison population, and whites and Hispanics make up 25% of the prison population. This is why Huberman, Daly, and the rest of them can get on TV and call our young kids thugs. They can call them thugs because we know that there's a system in place that is designed not to fund our educational institution in the inner cities. Go to your suburban communities, go to your affluent communities, and see if you see a cry about our kids not being funded. They have books, they have material, they have PE programs, they have music programs, they have arts, they have crafts. Their buildings are open on the weekend and during the week for parent and community involvement. When you come in our community, you got teachers copying books. You got desks falling apart. Washrooms that you got to hold your nose when you walk into. Yet in the midst of all this wealth that's flowing through the Board of Education with a $5 billion budget in the city of Chicago, with a tax base that is being eroded and used for everything but the properly education of our kids, when you have an outdated curriculum within our Chicago public school system that has lost the interest of our inner city kids, therefore there's no incentive for them to want to go to school, there's no incentive for them to want to learn because the curriculum is outdated. This is by design within our communities. And what's happening is we need to take control of the ins and outs of our community.